Tonight, you're not standing on a battlefield or watching flags go up over a fort. You're at a desk, looking at paper that's about to behave like a continent. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch a charter turn a trading room into a private state, see how ledgers learn to wear uniforms and carry cannons, and follow the quiet moment when the right to trade slid into the right to tax. It will look like paperwork. That's the trick. Quills tick like insect legs along the margins. A clerk pauses to blow on the ink. A wax seal cools in its little brass nest, soft at the edges, almost ready. Maps rest rolled on a shelf, but the canvas in the corner creaks as if the world outside has leaned in to hear the wording. Somewhere below, the Thames shifts against the hulls, rocking the office very slightly, as if the whole building were already at sea. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. Perhaps the next scratch of a quill will remember you there, half awake while the empire is still only a sentence on a page. Because tonight's story of the East India Company doesn't begin with a cannon blast. It begins when someone signs at the bottom and lets the ink dry. You might not expect a company to acquire a continent using receipts, but that is very close to what happened. The ink was slow. The quills were careful. A wax seal cooled while ships breathed in the tide like sleeping animals. Somewhere a clerk wrote the date twice, just to be sure the century wouldn't slip. This begins with a paper, not a drum. A charter, neat and velvet ribboned, that handed a counting house the right to behave like a compass. It told merchants where to sail and told rivals where not to. It promised exclusive trade as easily as a shopkeeper promises exact change. The wording was polite. The implications wore heavy boots. Either is fine. No pressure. The paper spoke of spices and islands and other items that look small on maps but large in a kitchen. It granted forts, if necessary, which is the sort of phrase that does a lot of work without breaking a sweat. The men who read it learn to hum in monsoon time voyages, planned by wind and rain instead of calendars. Profit would not be weekly. It would arrive in seasons, like mangoes or tax audits. A factory they called the trading posts, although they produced more paperwork than cloth. The door flaps opened to the sea and smelled of pepper and ink. Inside, tall shelves held bolts of calico and bottles of promises. Outside, smaller boats ferried bigger ideas to anchored ships. A flag climbed the mast, careful and shy, like a bookmark peeking from a difficult book. The flag did not name a nation, not yet. It acted as if it had one. Paper taught itself to walk. The offices bred an army in the margins, and the margins grew brave. A private regiment learned to keep time to European drums under tropical heat that made buttons feel philosophical. Local seaboys drilled in lines that marched across payroll and poetry with equal rhythm. Contracts became routine purchases of pepper, oaths of loyalty, leases of land where the ink took longer to dry. Clerks learned to sign like captains, and captains learned to count like clerks. A cannon placed by a ledger looked less like war and more like insurance. When ships returned, the cargo was measured twice, once by weight, once by expectation. At night, the accounts were squared, a nightly ritual like brushing one's teeth, only with more silver and the same insistence on neatness. A curious thing happened to the compass. It purchased shorelines. It found that a price could be placed on a river mouth and on a pass between hills, and that receipts could be stacked into walls. A fort could be justified as a warehouse, and a warehouse could include cannons if anyone asked too many questions. Committees in London nodded, and a cook in Surat stirred a pot of tea leaves into a new habit. The company's handwriting grew confident, while its seal grew heavier. Its letters crossed seas, then came back carrying slightly larger maps. Revenue is a calm word, but it can tilt villages. In 1765, a new permission slipped into the account book like a bookmark that cannot be ignored. The company acquired the rights to collect revenue in Bengal. The right to tax sounds boring until you notice how cumulative it is, like sand falling into a jar faster than you can empty it with a teaspoon. The collectors learn new vocabulary without changing their handwriting. Zamdar, riot, assessment, settlement. The words tilted the balance from grain to silver. In the old rhythm, a harvest listened to monsoon and moon. In the new rhythm, it listened to fiscal year and schedule. Somewhere, a field baked a little longer because a clerk needed an amount that did not include rain. A famine followed efficiency with unsettling politeness. Markets were told to decide what bellies already knew. Those who measured could not measure winds. It is the sort of mistake that looks reasonable when printed and unbearable when counted on fingers. Across the sea, voices developed a taste for the word nabob, which is what London liked to call company men who returned rich and noisy, with embroidered furniture and uncomfortable confidence. Parliament sniffed the air and suspected that an accounting trick had escaped its notebook. Regulating acts arrived with the tone of a teacher who has finally found the mischief in a class ledger. Out went trust, and came oversight. Governors would be appointed, audits would be demanded. Dispatches would be phrased in a calm that means the opposite. Yet the machine had already memorized the shipping lanes. Revenue flowed upriver to the capital, while rumors flowed downriver to the docks. Reports sailed for England on paper that rustled like dry leaves, such a quiet sound for such large consequences. In Bengal, collectors calibrated their estimates with rulers that did not bend. In London, committees read those estimates with glasses that always needed cleaning. Between them, the countryside learned to translate crops into columns. The new arithmetic was stubborn. Villages that could not square the sum found themselves roundly in debt. In the warehouses, the bales stacked and exhaled. On the ledgers, the numbers stacked and did not. Tea is a leaf, a habit, and an empire in ceramic disguise. When tea met sugar in a London cup, it formed a public relationship. The spoon clinked with a sound that traveled further than most ships. Calico from Indian looms crept into wardrobes that had never seen a monsoon. A triangle appeared on the map that was not strictly a triangle, but behaved like one. Opium moved east to a market that wanted tea to move west, and silver wandered in between them like a distracted courier. The moral geometry was questionable. The arithmetic looked tidy. In Boston, crates took a brief moonlight swim, and a city performed a disagreement with invoices. The protest had a logo more than a king, and the logo did not duck. Meanwhile, weavers at Indian looms counted threads the way tax collectors counted rupees carefully with a slightly furrowed brow. Cloth crossed oceans folded into packages, and with each folding the wage inside grew thinner. A small absurdity. In some seasons, the value of a bolt of cloth and the cost of the rope that strapped it to a mule were written in the same tidy hand, as if they were cousins. It is the kind of cousinship that keeps a family together until it doesn't. Forts misbehaved by looking like offices with thicker walls. They charged tariff-like greetings to visiting boats and maintained cordial relationships with their cannons. A port could be purchased as patiently as a book is read, paragraph by paragraph, jetty by jetty. Protection could be offered even to those who had not asked, in the tone of an umbrella extended under a sun that does not plan to rain. Poppy fields flared into orderly rows, as if botanical gardens had discovered accountancy. Resin was guided into balls and stamped with an obedience that felt administrative rather than agricultural. Cups of tea steamed in drawing rooms thousands of miles away, the flavor deepened by someone else's season. A harbor became a price, and a pass became a clause appended to a treaty. You could walk along the new-built embankment and not hear the water for the scratching of pens. New roads joined dots that had not asked to be connected. New police learned to salute not just uniforms, but signatures. Taxes were shoes and traveled. The ledger cannot take a bullet, but in 1857 something near it did. Rumor galloped faster than rail, carried on carts and courtyards, across cantonments, and through rows of cartridges greased in insult. Grievances waited politely for a generation and then shouted all at once. The company's private order met a public disorder with a speed that knocked bookkeepers from their stools. Stations fell in a rhythm that marched like a paragraph of short, alarmed sentences. Swords and telegraphs spoke over one another in overlapping accents. The columns that had mastered crops faltered at crowds. The neat balance between profit and payroll slid off the page. If this were a different show, we might dwell on the heat and dust. Here we notice something quieter, the way a seal looks when it realizes it can no longer authorize tomorrow. The handwriting changed. The strokes grew slower, the loops larger, the dates more deliberate, like a person composing a letter they do not want to send. And then the company's roll folded like a finished sail and was carried below. A crown replaced a charter as tidily as one rubber stamp replaces another on a file already thick with decisions. The company's structures remained standing, but they were now painted with imperial gloss. Railways grew along the old logic of freight and speed, carrying both soldiers and salt. Post offices delivered patience. Telegraphs delivered impatience in dots and dashes. Surveyors learned to walk with chains and notebooks, their footsteps the metronome of a land that was being measured into knowledge and jurisdiction at the same time. Law codes arrived with stitched spines and the smell of new glue, and they settled into desks beside revenue manuals like two elderly cats who have learned to share the same sunlit patch. Ports were dredged. Police learned new habits of hat and salute. Schools opened to train clerks who could outclerk their teachers. The company had designed a system for profit. The crown kept the system for governance. A kind of afterlife arrived tidy, procedural, fond of registers and stamps, and the sensible weight of a bound volume. In this afterlife, the small daily objects carried history's weight without making a fuss. A stamp receipt allowed a cart to cross a river and therefore allowed a town to grow. A mail route drawn to expedite invoices now delivered marriage proposals and exam results. The language of entries and debits trained a generation to think in dates and amounts, even when they were thinking about marriages and harvests. The survey maps, neat and speckled, became the underlay for telephone lines, irrigation channels, and a future that often mistook the straight line for the best line. Municipal boards learned an imperial talent for minutes taken in perpetuity. Somewhere a clerk, still competent, still tired, still proud of a tidy column of figures, balanced a budget, and then went home to drink tea he had once helped to tax. He might have smiled at the circularity if he had not been so busy sharpening pencils. The seal broke, formally with ceremony and relief, yet much of the method stayed. Even after independence, the rails kept the same stubborn habit of reaching the stations exactly where freight had once preferred. Offices kept the same stubborn habit of favoring forms that required extra copies. The customs shed learned only slowly to spell different names on the same clipboard. The company's ghost was procedural. It lived in registries, tariff schedules, tender notices, and the certain way a file prefers to travel with the proper note attached. A curious legacy, neither glorious nor minor. The empire absorbed a company. The company had already absorbed a state. The habits outlived both. If you've drifted a little, that is all right. Many people drift while reading minutes. It is one of the minute's secret kindnesses. There are tiny stories that still lean against the large one, like bicycles against a long wall. A weaver in a quiet town learned to cut cloth to suit a London pattern he would never wear. A magistrate learned to sign his name in a script his grandfather would have admired and feared at once. A hill pass that had been a rumor of goats became a metal road built to a specification derived from axle widths written in a schedule typed in a city that had never seen the hill. A harbor tender learned to collect a fee whose origin story lay in a treaty clause negotiated on a balcony 2 generations before his birth. An accountant in an inland district learned to calculate net revenue with such devotion that he could do it while someone described the weather. These are not dramatic facts, but they are durable. The empire's big words, conquest, civilization, dominion, evaporate in the heat. The small words, invoice, receipt, record stay in the drawer forever. If you look back to the beginning, to that ribbon charter with its polite menace, you can trace a neat line of continuity. The instruments, ship, warehouse, regiment, court changed uniforms and slogans, but the rhythm of entry and audit remained like a bass note that nobody bothers to name because it is always there. The company taught the status style, how to seal a letter, how to file a complaint, how to assess a harvest, how to pretend that numbers behave the same way in drought and flood. The state, in return, taught the company humility by replacing it. This too is a transaction, only one that cannot be recorded in a single column. If you would like a moral, the company cannot provide one. It only provides balance sheets. If you would like sleep, those are excellent reading. Night settles the way a thick book closes. Ports go quiet except for chains yawning in their sleep. In an archive, somewhere, a leather volume breathes out dust, and a hand careful not to smudge draws a finger down a column of old rupees, adding them quietly, then subtracting, then underlining the total with a line so straight it could be a railway. Outside, the monsoon tests the roof, and the roof passes the exam. Inside, the page waits for morning with the patience of paper. The company is gone, the habits are not, and the tide, which has never read a ledger, continues to come in, to go out, and to ignore the totals with a serenity any accountant might envy. If your eyes are heavy, let them be. The seal cools. The quill rests in the glass. Somewhere a clerk, still awake in history, blows on a line of ink that does not need to dry anymore. You might not expect a nation to calm itself by measuring a line it could not see, but that is more or less how France invented the meter. The idea was tender and tidy. Take a meridian, the imaginary seam that buttons north to south, and choose a single generous fraction of it. 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the pole to the equator along the Paris line would be enough. They said, like cutting a ribbon from the earth that was both ceremonial and usable. It would be fair to all, belonging to no king and no cottage, the way midnight belongs equally to the rooster and the astronomer. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe, or simply allow your eyelids to perform their own standardization and gently close. The committee that proposed the meter loved decimals the way gardeners love straight rows. 10 was a comfort, 10 fingers, 10 tenths. 10 waits patiently in every pocket. And so a new plan unrolled like a measuring tape across the map. Send 2 teams to triangulate the Paris meridian from Dunkirk down to Barcelona, stitch the angles into distances, and compute the fraction that would become everyone's new yard without the Y. Nothing more dramatic than geometry. Nothing more radical than an agreed piece of string. The instruments were polite, brass and glass, with a talent for pretending they were simple. There were repeating circles that repeated in case the first decision felt shy long rules, with edges truer than a priest. And zenith sectors that asked stars to hold still for a moment while they drew a small bow across the sky. Triangulation is the quiet person's way of crossing mountains. You begin with a baseline, an actual stretch of ground, measured with rods so fussy that cows were asked to chew elsewhere, and from that line, you sight a distant steeple and a farther hilltop, and then another steeple until the land becomes a lace of triangles strung from bell tower to bell tower. The beauty of the plan was that the earth did most of the work. Church spires had already risen where surveyors needed them, as if the saints had predicted the metric system and left helpful pointers. The sea winds, more punctual than any minister, cleared the air for early morning sightings. Breakfast was thin, angles were fat, and because France was experimenting with reason the way bakers experiment with new yeast, Decimal time briefly joined the party. There would be 10 hours in a day. Each hour would have 100 minutes. Watches develop the same squint you are feeling now, and then return to the old way when nobody remembered when to have lunch. It was a trip of minutes and shadows. Along farm tracks, the surveyors carried their circles and padded crates that made them look like they were moving very delicate furniture. Taverns learned the new vocabulary. A good inn had ale, oats, and a place to set a repeating circle without wobble. Villagers watched the astronomers climb their steeples and then look at the sky in daytime, which is not how most people do it. The trick was to catch the sun's angle at noon, as if you were politely asking it to autograph a line on the horizon. In fields, the baseline rods lay end to end in neat succession, each joint pressed with a level, each expansion noted when the sun turned the metal thoughtful and longer. A micro hook for anyone who likes practical confessions. The official baseline at Milan came with correction tables for temperature so meticulous that the rods behaved like shy animals, longer when warm, shorter when cool, perfectly normal, nothing to be ashamed of. All this was framed by the revolution, which provided a lively background noise of new calendars and loud debates, while the surveyors worked with the stubborn pace of moss. If the politics shouted, the triangles whispered. Town councils changed. Latitude did not. The meridian felt immune to enthusiasm. One of the astronomers, a patient man with a talent for quiet panic, worried about an error he could not discuss easily with a committee that preferred perfection. But the meter, like most good measurements, was kind to average behavior. Thousands of small uncertainties curled into one comfortable number that would still let tailors cut sleeves and masons stack stones correctly. Gendarmes asked for papers. The stars provided clearance. Mountains arrived like contrary footnotes to the plan. The Pyrenees did not take instruction from Paris. Their ridges were handsome, which is not a property you can place in a table. The surveyors climbed with instruments strapped like cautious pets. On the top, they found the usual combination of wind and excellent view, and the single worst surface for leveling anything. A repeating circle wants stillness the way a cat wants sun. To persuade a very round instrument to sit square on a very uneven rock requires all the rhetorical skill of shims. Steeples that had been so cooperative in Normandy were less numerous here. The angles had to leap mountain to mountain, as if the geometry had taken up athletics. Clouds discovered just when to drift. Frost decided just when to nibble. Papers had to be weighted with stones so that calculations did not climb off the mountain entirely and sail to Spain without a passport. Spain, for its part, offered distances that were easy to walk and occasionally hard to count. A baseline near Barcelona was chalked across a plain that pretended it was level until someone asked it to be, and then it shrugged in centimeters. But the cathedral towers were generous, and the Mediterranean provided a line so patient it might have been a diagram. From hilltops, the surveyors waved to lighthouses as if the sea had agreed to join the academy. At dusk, the sun made a crimson protractor of the horizon, then went politely away so that the stars could take their shift. The astronomers wrote down numbers that had the moral clarity of soup recipes, just enough, not too much. Stir again, compare, repeat. A curiosity to keep you drowsily amused. The tiny error bars on some angles were smaller than the ink dots that announced them. Perfection hid inside punctuation. The journey back through the triangles gathered small-town legends. Somewhere a child learned that men could build a map using nothing more dangerous than patience. Somewhere a baker learned that the cake of the earth is most dependably sliced by right triangles. Somewhere a mayor signed more permissions than mutters home. The surveyors left behind them a trail of gossip about dignified people counting seconds as if they were useful, and laying rods on the ground as if they were composing a very long flute. Donkeys, who have no sympathy for science but a lot of experience with loads, carried the boxes as seriously as if they contained fresh melons. The surveyors paid them complimentarily in grain and mutual stubbornness. From measurements to Paris to metal, the result of all this patient looking was not a poem but a bar. The final meter, agreed upon with a solemnity usually reserved for oaths and recipes, was cast in platinum because platinum behaves as if it were designed to ignore the weather. The bar sat at a very specific temperature in a very calm room and pretended to be exactly the right length. It was the physical promise the Republic made to tradesmen and scholars. Here is a unit that will not depend on an English thumb, a railgate, a local tradition, or a memory of how far your uncle says it is to the next village. The bar crossed the room occasionally to visit a balance, the way a cat crosses to remind the furniture who is in charge. Copies were made and shipped like missionaries of measurement to other capitals, tucked in velvet and escorted by instructions that sounded like etiquette. Do not touch too often. Do not hurry the cooling. Be respectful of temperature. Alongside the meter bar waited the liter and the kilogram, which arrived like agreeable siblings. A cubic decimeter of water, at its favorite temperature, promised to be 1 kilogram. The liter was the space that water wanted when it was feeling volumetric. Decimal fractions open like drawers, centimeters, millimeters, liters sliced into tenths and hundredths, the way a cake invites fair shares. In the markets, merchants learned to weigh produce on balances that spoke in regular units instead of in complicated local stories. If you brought onions to town, you no longer had to translate between the Paris pound, the provincial pound, the pound your grandmother trusted, and the pound the neighbor swore by when selling butter. The change was quietly revolutionary. Arguments were now about price, not about the size of the scale's smile. The new calendar tried to join the party and arrived with months named after weather Brumaire for fog, Thermidor for heat, as if the year were simply a mood ring. Weeks were banished. Decades of days took their place. The Festival of Opinion had an official date, which seems more self-aware than most festivals. Decimal time made another attempt to be the future and failed with excellent manners. Factory whistles ignored the 10-hour day and continued to behave like roosters. People are traditional about lunch, but the meter stayed. It is easy to like a unit that does not change when you cross a hill. There was a ceremonious little argument over whether the meter should continue to belong to a platinum bar or to something even more abstract. And in time, the abstraction won. Light, which has no patience for politics and a well-documented speed, adopted the meter. The distance light travels in a tiny fraction of a second would be our ruler, it was decided. The bar retired gracefully to a museum, much like a mayor who keeps the key to the city behind glass for schoolchildren to admire. The meter's circle of friends widened into the international system, which is the grown-up way of saying, let us agree on everything down to the last ampere so we can argue about other things. Laboratories rewrote their measurements with the satisfaction of bookkeepers reconciled to a final digit. Road crews painted their signs in kilometers. Tailors measured in centimeters. Bridge builders, who suspect every unit until a bridge stands, grew comfortable in meters and then in megawatts and megapascals, which sound like opera but behave like math. The new unit had gently comic adventures. Somewhere a carpenter set a meter rule next to a yardstick and felt the small discomfort of mixed languages. Somewhere a traveler looked at a 2-liter bottle of mineral water as if it were an affectionate exaggeration. Somewhere a teacher explained that centimeters do not exist on the other team. S-ruler and watched students practice code switching between inches and cents. Conversions learned to wear calm expressions, 2.54 centimeters, the little treaty inside every desk. The meter, meanwhile, kept doing what good rulers do, sitting quietly, being used, and making very little conversation. It asked that you multiply by 10 when you felt lively and divide by 10 when you wished to rest. Copies of the original meter went to other capitals and behaved like dignitaries who only attend ribbon cuttings. They had no practical use once the light had taken over the definition. Still, they glow with the comfort of objects that meant well. Under glass, they produce naps in school groups and respect in old engineers who remember fitting a tolerance that depended ultimately on a bar in Paris. A nice, sleepy footnote. The platinum iridium alloy used for later standards was carefully chosen so that the bar would not wrinkle with age. One cannot say as much for most of us. If you tilt history slightly, you can see all the careers this simple unit created. Precision machinists found themselves in long, peaceful relationships with numbers that sleep in tents. Chemists found that solutions become less moody when molarity is defined in leaders that behave. Surveyors learned to think in grids that tamed rivers and sometimes forgot to listen to them. Astronomers, who had begun the whole enterprise by nodding to stars, now declared distances to galaxies in meters that wandered off the map and returned with exponents like kites. The humble meter left fingerprints on disciplines that never expected to be standardized. The way a librarian's habit of alphabetizing sneaks into the kitchen spice rack. There is a shy philosophy under the meter. If you choose a unit from the Earth's dimensions, you are saying that human things should connect to non-human constants, that a tailor's tape and a planet's curve can shake hands. You're hinting that fairness might live in measurement, and that markets calm themselves if they all use the same yard that is not a yard. It is not a large idea. It is persistently small. Standardization replaces grand certainty with quiet predictability. Napoleon once mocked the meter with the impatience of a man confronting a line that refused to march under his command. Later, his codes adopted it because a clear measurement is the greatest general in a warehouse. Reason is stubborn that way. It waits while uniforms change and then becomes the stationery of the next office. On the street, the meter is simply how far it is to the bakery. In the shop, it is the cloth you will need for a sleeve and a bit extra for when your nephew grows. On the bridge, it is the distance between bolts that never fail together. In the field, it is the spacing of vines that makes the vineyard look like music. At the airport, it is the length of the walkway that pretends you are not walking. As a lullaby detail, the width of your pillowcase is probably close to half a meter. The body knows the meter with no mathematics, a step, a reach, a small stretch to the cupboard's top shelf. We are all unpaid surveyors. Our arms still report to the old meridian, whether they know it or not. By now, the first teams who triangulated the Earth would find our phones indecently confident. They would watch a satellite whisper a position in meters and smile, or possibly sigh, at how easily we now do in a pocket what once required crates and permission slips. Even the satellites, however, live in the old discipline, angles checked, clocks synchronized, baselines laid not on fields, but between orbits. A GPS receiver is a descendant of the baseline rods, only faster and unbothered by cattle. The continuity is comforting. Geometry still gets us home. If you are still with me, your breathing could try a decimal. In for 5, out for 10. It is arbitrary and therefore perfectly in keeping with the spirit of standards. The meter keeps no secrets and offers no plot twists. It is a line that stayed a line when the calendar changed hats and the government tried a few different signatures. Somewhere the platinum bar sleeps, somewhere light keeps racing. Everywhere, a tape measure snaps back into its housing with that tidy little sound that says the work is finished, but the units remain available for tomorrow. It is not a grand ending. It is a draw closing gently. The triangles that strung a nation together fold back into the case. The church spires return to ringing the hour the way they prefer. The sea continues to level itself without noting anyone's baseline. And along the old Paris meridian, which still imagines itself a perfect seam, evening settles like a ruler laid carefully across a desk, straight, quiet, and ready to be lifted again. You might not expect street numbers to have an origin story, but the quiet arithmetic on your front door was once a public debate, a policing tool, and a fashion. Before numbers, cities navigated by memory and metaphors. Letters arrived addressed to the house by the fig tree, or the third door after the shoemaker, with a noisy parrot, or in the lane where the rain stalls. Fire brigades hunted for smoke rather than addresses. Landlords described property the way sailors describe wind by where it had been last noticed. A midwife could find a cradle without counting, an official not so easily. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe, or simply let your attention wander like a postman without a map, which is also historically accurate. The first impulse to number things came from ordinary nuisances: taxes, conscription lists, epidemics, and rent. Governments prefer arithmetic you can nail to a wall. So in the mid-1700s, soldiers and clerks in neat coats began to chalk digits on doorways as if they were labeling chess squares. Vienna tried it on barracks streets. Paris experimented when inspectors needed to count where the blankets were and where the people. Some towns used red paint that weather scolded into pink. Others chose charcoal, which obligingly vanished in the first rain, erasing policy by drizzle. You can watch the spread of numbers as a kind of mild bureaucracy blossoming. Madrid had policemen who adored categories. They drafted address books like cookbooks: take one block, stir in an even number of evens, simmer with odds. Berlin adopted blue enamel plates because enamel looks official even on a sleepy afternoon. The Habsburgs, tidy by temperament, tried to number houses across entire provinces, which produced the imperial comedy of conscription numbers, a peasant hut and a palace both labeled in one long sequence, climbing the valleys like a slow staircase. You could be house 298 in a village of 12 cottages because the previous 286 belonged to other villages you never visit. Those numbers age like heroic ancestry, irrelevant and cherished. A tiny micro hook. Some inns repainted their digits larger to seem more important. A marketing tactic identical in principle to modern sandwich boards, and also to birds fluffing their feathers. Resistance came from people who sensed, correctly, that numbers are semicolons in state sentences. The Swiss scraped theirs off at night. Londoners joked that last week's number might not recognize its reflection after a municipal meeting. In Paris, neighbors argued about whether even numbers should live on the right or the left, which is the sort of quarrel civilizations have when bread is temporarily stable. Rome vacillated between clockwise and counterclockwise. Even today, a traveler walking a Roman street can feel numbers climbing like a cat and then suddenly descending like a lift, because someone decided that odds and evens should be polite neighbors rather than opposite rivals. Meanwhile, the Postal Service, an institution with patience bordering on theology, discovered that addresses work best when they stay still, a principle not universally honored by revolutions. The technology of numbers learned manners. Early plates were iron that rusted thoughtfully. Later ones were porcelain that ignored weather. Finally, thin aluminum learned to reflect light for ambulances that dislike ambiguity. The typography settled too. Fat letters looked cheerful but flabby. Thin ones were elegant and invisible. National tastes emerged because even digits carry accents. French 2 leaned with a flourish. German 7 acquired a bar like a tiny passport. The American 1 learned to wear a serif or not, depending on whether the city preferred to resemble a ledger or a warehouse. In Prague, numbers ride on antique blue shields like small heraldic fish. In Kyoto, blocks and sub-blocks braid themselves into addresses that feel like directions through a garden. The world standardized almost everything except style, which is reasonable. A number must be obedient and local at the same time, like a dog that understands both its name and the neighborhood's gossip. Because numbers are helpful, they made new fictions possible. Fire insurance companies in 18th century, London issued emblems, small tin badges fixed above doorways, to tell their private brigades which houses deserved water. Once numbers arrived, the badges were decoration. the brigades could count with confidence. A city directory, once a book full of poets' metaphors, near the lime kiln, opposite the gossiping fountain, became a proper catalog. Real estate agents learned to divide streets into aspirations. Lower numbers have more morning sun. Higher numbers pretend to be closer to the park. Both are technically true if you adjust your map's enthusiasm. The quietest humor in urban life is watching a shop move 3 doors down, repaint its number, and insist it has reinvented itself. The odd even convention has the simplicity of a lullaby. Odds on one side, evens on the other, a gentle ping-pong that lets the postman keep rhythm. But cities are memory, not math. Some streets number from a river inland. Others return to the river halfway along, as if the tide pulled the digits back. In many American towns, the courthouse is 0. In others, 0 is an idea they do not discuss. Here and there, the number 13 disappears from an apartment stack, banished like an unlucky umbrella, replaced slyly by 1 2A or an innocent 14. Italy sometimes distrusts 17, which rearranged as Roman numerals spells out a hint of death. Apartment managers make numerology into architecture. In East Asia, the digit 4 can be unwelcome because its name shakes hands with the word for death. Buildings skip floors the way stories skip difficult conversations. If you fall asleep while considering whether the elevator changed floors or just names, you are in good historical company. Once numbers existed, the desire to improve them arrived on schedule. Grids in new American cities promised fairness, the 1,000 block, the 2,000 block, equity printed on the map. The city of Philadelphia, perked up by William Penn's fondness for rectangles, made east-west streets numerical and north-south streets botanical, a system that lets you live at the intersection of arithmetic and a tree. Manhattan took it further. Avenue numbers ballooned bravely northward. Cross streets climbed like a staircase whose destination was optimism. Peculiarities remained, Broadway meandering like a river that forgot it was paved. 4th Avenue shyly renaming itself Park Avenue in a sort of social migration. Washington, D.C., practiced letters, numbers, and quadrants with a Roman self-confidence that practically hands you a compass with your coffee. All these designs presume a city can be learned, not merely endured. Renumbering was its own circus. Imagine living at 8 Willow Lane in June and 156 Willow Lane in September, because the council decided progress. Shopkeepers had to order new receipts. Lovers had to update their secret notes. Ghosts relocated politely. Some towns hired men to walk the length of the street with a measuring wheel, assigning a number for every so many feet, which is how you get addresses like 4,408 for a house that has never felt like a 4,000 anything. A micro-hook that barely qualifies as a joke. 1. European city issued such small numbers originally that after a century of subdividing plots, the sequence read like a decimal expansion. No, 18 3/4, which is also the mood of a very narrow bakery. Rural addresses change late and abruptly. In the 20th century, emergency services discovered that the yellow farmhouse past the stump was not an ambulance-friendly specification. So counties adopted E911 addresses, and millers who had lived at the Bend by the Sycamore found themselves legally moved to 4,386 County Road H mailboxes, suddenly learned to count. Grids placed arithmetic on fields. Some farmers put the old names on signs beneath the new numbers, as if to reassure the land that its stories had not been deleted, only translated. The logic of the grid, every 40 or 80 meters a potential number takes a gentle snooze across the countryside. Long roads with 4-digit addresses creeping like unrolled tape measures. House numbers quietly change politics too. Census takers became precise. Voting districts acquired edges sharper than a garden fence. Slums gained visibility where numbers gathered. Maps no longer allowed officials to pretend certain streets were rumors. Police grew fond of addresses because handcuffs like clarity. Spies, ever contradictory, disliked them for the same reason and used drop boxes named after bakeries again. Social reformers measured progress in house numbers, the infant mortality on one block against the next. The water supply at 220 better than at 218 because a pipe was finely scaled correctly. A soft paradox. The more exact the address, the more easily a city can be compassionate. Just as importantly, house numbers taught cities to speak to strangers. A tourist with an address is not lost. A newcomer with a number is halfway included. A letter from a distant aunt reaches the little blue plate that shines at dusk, and behind it the kettle knows to boil. The number becomes a stage name for a house. You say, "See you at 64," as if 64 were a person. Some people prefer their number to their street because it stays while the street's name can be persuaded to honor a new hero. In Paris, the revolution renamed streets with the energy of diary keepers. House numbers sat through the drama like bored ushers, older than politics and better at pointing. In Istanbul, for decades, numbers were stamped on little ceramic lozenges, and the glaze remembered sun more faithfully than any map. In Havana, the numbers are painted directly on stucco, and you can watch the paint perform its own calendar of years gone by. When electricity arrived with its bright certainty, addresses stretched to include new kinds of precision: postcodes, zones, zips. London invented postal districts so that even a hurried clerk could triage. N1 wants this pile, SW3 prefers that. The system was an essay in courtesy. It apologized for the city's size by giving each neighborhood a shorthand handshake. The United States, which enjoys large numbers and large mailbags, added 5 digits, then 4 more, a kind of arithmetical sigh that says both we are organized and there's always more. Canada chose letters with numbers in a tidy alternation, like a chessboard address for parka weather. Japan, careful and unique, preferred block numbers over street names. So you navigate by understanding the neighborhood's family tree rather than by following a single linear parrot. None of these methods decided to be wrong. All of them decided to be themselves. There were mischiefs. A real estate developer realized that an address ending in 0 feels important, so he rearranged lot boundaries to harvest more status digits. A street with a reputation for elegance lobbied to shift its numbers to align with the perceived better end, inching the arithmetic toward aspiration. Politicians renamed a road but left the numbers alone, creating archival footnotes that keep librarians fond of their jobs. In older quarters, alleyways inherited numbers from vanished buildings, leading to addresses that insist you turn left into a wall. Postmen, who spend their days composing solution sets, simply smile and try the other door. Somewhere, someone lives at 1.5 and laughs every time a package arrives addressed to 1.5, which is what a house becomes when history and measurement shake hands without grip strength. The digital age tried to retire the door plate and discovered that software also needs a number. Geocoders are new surveyors, tracing invisible triangles between satellites and attics. Rideshare drivers bless the clarity of a glowing 1728, then drive past it anyway because the curb is busy. Food delivery turned addresses into appetites. Drop it 22B is the modern equivalent of by the fig tree, except the fig tree has become a buzzer and a small dog. Navigation apps tidy the chaos. Then they introduce their own. Pin drops that land on rooftops, courtyards that borrow neighboring numbers, one-way streets that argue with optimistic arrows. Through it all, the modest house plate continues to do its job in paint and metal, analog and correct. You can still look up from your screen and read your fate in digits. Numbers on doors contain cultural weather. In Victorian Britain, many families polished their brass numerals on Saturdays, a ritual of respectability that made arithmetic shine. In parts of India, wall painters carry stencils of numerals and political symbols. During election seasons, numbers briefly share space with slogans, like roommates who do not speak but split the rent. In some Mediterranean towns, hand-painted tiles turn addresses into mosaics, as if digits had wandered into a museum and asked for a pastel. In Scandinavia, the fonts are so calm they feel like good advice. In New York, the fire code demands numerals of a certain size and color so that trucks can argue with smoke more efficiently. Chaos is allowed, but not illegibility. The house number smiles, indifferent to fashion, slightly square about safety. And then there are the side stories you notice only when counting becomes cozy. Corner buildings with two numbers were a tiny identity crisis. 14 on one facade, 201 on the other, a bilingual house. Cul-de-sacs adopt suffixes, court, place, loop, and the numbers breathe smaller, as if the street were whispering. Rural routes keep memory alive by leaving the old route name in parentheses on the sign, because asphalt is tender about grandparents. In certain college towns, students steal the number 420 so consistently that landlords bolt it to steel plates or surrender and label the door 420-1, which does not confuse the students at all. Some municipalities test high visibility reflective numerals by driving past at 30 miles an hour after dusk. If the number blinks in time for a sleepy human to read it, the plate passes its exam. Behind the scenes, address databases grow mouse duplicates, typos, the eternal mystery of zero, which is sometimes a corner lot, and sometimes an absent lot, and sometimes the municipal dream of a parcel yet to be. City planners keep long spreadsheets where addresses march in columns like obedient ants, and every so often a cell contains a story, demolished, renumbered in 1974, vacant cat only. Archivists love those notes. They are footpaths in the forest of bureaucracy. On the other side of the counter, people learn their numbers gently. Children first memorize their own. Teenagers test how far past theirs they are allowed to wander. Adults negotiate moving, which is mostly about deciding which future number you can imagine writing for many years on envelopes and forms and the small heart of home. If the invention of house numbers has a moral, it is mild. Clarity is kind. Numbers do not fix roofs or stop floods, but they help a city deliver itself to its residents. A nurse with a midnight kit, a friend with soup, a taxi at the last minute, all arithmetic in motion. Armies use numbers too. Everyone does. But the permanent work of addresses is domestic. They let the milk find the stoop. They let a bouquet locate surprise. They let the census understand how many chairs a neighborhood may need in its schools. And in a softer sense, they give people a way to say, here, that is neither myth nor bragging. Here is a number and a name and a bit of sky. By now, perhaps you can imagine the first inspector with chalk in his pocket moving along a street where houses were only nicknames. He pauses at a doorway, considers the angle of the sun, listens to a baker mutter about flour, then writes a digit as politely as a signature. The chalk fades, but the habit remains. Later, a tinsmith screws a plate to the brick, and the sound is so small you can mistake it for a bird tapping. Night falls. The digits catch lamplight like tiny moons, and the city acquires its bedtime arithmetic. Up and down the block, odds breathe left, evens breathe right, and the street counts itself to sleep. You might not expect a corporation to borrow a crown and return an empire, but that is one way to describe a ledger that learned to march. Picture the year tilting toward winter in 1600, the air thick with beeswax and parchment, a table crowded with men who believed that a charter was a sort of magic cloak. They asked a queen for a signature and received not only permission to trade, but the right to behave like geography. A company that could mint coins and build forts is technically a shop with an army, which is tidy on paper and complicated near a shoreline. If you're still awake a few minutes from now, you can subscribe, or simply let this drift past your ears like the creak of canvas over a slow gray sea, which is the recommended speed for this topic. The first fact to get friendly with is that merchants think in seasons and storms. Profit arrives after the monsoon the way figs follow summer. Ships leave when winds say please. The new company drew maps that were really calendars. Routes were arguments with currents. On deck, sailors counted peppercorns the way gamblers count beads, and in counting they believed themselves honest. Somewhere below, a clerk inked the names of ports with such care that a misspelling could delay a cargo by months. The company's officers, who could quote prices the way poets quote lines, stared toward India as if staring were a form of navigation. The charter allowed them to build factories, which were not factories as we use the word now, but warehouses that smelled of cotton, cinnamon, and the inside of a locked room. A factory was a fort with an account book. Walls defended columns of numbers. Men put on boots that were also titles. A clerk arrived in Surat and, by the back of an order, became a captain of purchasing. Drums learned European rhythms to keep sepoy feet in step. Obedience, like cloth, is measured in yards. Treaties were written as invoices, 1 part pepper, 1 part politeness, due upon delivery. And the flag on the mast pleasant, brisk behaved like a nation's, but politely denied being one. Mornings began with prayers and price lists. Afternoons attended to rumors, the old weather of trade. Evenings counted coins, then counted them again because copper is shy. Somewhere, a notary cooled a wax seal and watched it harden into the shape of a future court case. The whole apparatus hissed quietly like roasting spice, a soft, deliberate sound with the absolute confidence of arithmetic. The business of trade prefers small motions, but taxation prefers a tide. When the company acquired the right to collect land revenue in Bengal in the 1760s, it discovered that a ledger could be a river. Diwani, a word that made accountants feel tall, meant that money no longer merely arrived at factories. It flowed in from fields as if numbers were crops. A village that once paid the local landlord now paid clerks who wrote in a language of columns and signatures. New vocabulary grew like moss. Zamindar and riot, collector and inspector, remission and arrears. A famine came hard on the heels of efficiency, as famines often do when systems believe themselves smarter than rain. Grain, trained by market signals, walked toward ships when it needed to walk toward kitchens. The company learned that oversight is a timid animal. It follows familiar paths, London to Calcutta and back, while villages live a long day's walk away. Parliament, protective of principle and tea, began to sniff the books. An East India scandal traveled to Westminster in the leather belly of a trunk, where it was applauded by bored MPs grateful for an adjective stronger than adequate. They invented committees the way bakers invent buns, hot, frequent, and forgettable. Nabob and his suspicion entered the London air. The word described a man who left as a clerk and returned with a palace in his pocket, who bought a country house with rupees so numerous they squeaked. Satirical print showed noses lifted by the weight of Indian gold. Moral accounting tightened like a collar. The company's privacy felt suddenly unfashionable. Regulations arrived wrapped in Act of Parliament ribbon, declaring that an empire might continue if it learned to blush on command. Yet the machine kept turning, because ships already knew the routes by heart and sugar respects momentum. Auditors wrote findings that sounded like weather reports, irregular showers of bribery, scattered clouds of negligence, a stiff breeze of dividends. And still, in the villages, a man brought a measured basket of paddy to the tax office and watched the scales settle like a verdict. He paid with grain, and the grain became ink, and the ink became a ship. It is a simple transformation if you are not hungry. The world changed again when tea and textiles decided to hold hands. Cotton from Indian looms met London clocks. Time ran along warp and weft. Calico, a word so cheerful it almost winks, migrated into English wardrobes until domestic weavers complained with a kind of patriotic itch. Parliament wore wool and sympathy and briefly tried to ban cotton prints, evidence that fashion can outrun statutes in comfortable shoes. Meanwhile, the triangular appetites of trade grew busy: opium to China, tea to Britain, silver to somewhere it had not planned to rest. Every box had a destination and a moral. A sleepy, small absurdity. Tea buyers who could discuss tannins at breakfast financed habits more complex than a teacup admits. Bostonians, irritated by the elegance of taxation without conversation, tipped crates into Blackwater one evening and then, very carefully, swept the decks because tidiness is not incompatible with protest. In London, a fellow with a long face corrected the books to reflect the missing tea, wrote loss on a line, and went home to explain that history had just been to the office. Elsewhere, red poppies bloomed in ordered rows, a flower cultivated like a policy. The Jews dried brown, then traveled wrapped in responsibility. In Chinese ports, officials wrote memorials and physicians wrote recipes. Neither solved the arithmetic. Treaties, which once smelled of pepper, developed a sharper odor and followed gunboats like bubbles follow bar soap. Factories on the Indian coast began to look less like houses and more like fortresses again. Yet in drawing rooms, teacups chimed politely, and saucers performed their small miracles of spill prevention. A nation can sip while it argues. It is a skill acquired over centuries. By the middle of the 19th century, the company had gotten used to being indispensable, which is the kind of habit history dislikes. Telegraph wires began stitching provinces into sentences. Railways translated distance into timetables. Cartridges whispered rumors. Pride walked quickly. In 1857, anger that had been accumulating like lint found a match. Revolt flared, chaotic and local and vast, the way a field of dry grass does when the wind agrees with flame. You can read long shelves about it, or note one domestic detail. Many of the telegraph lines stayed busy. News outran rumor for perhaps the first time on the subcontinent. The company proved unexpectedly mortal. After the smoke, the crown arrived like a parent to a boarding school and declared the experiment complete. A sovereign seal replaced a company stamp. The logo retired to stationery. The system it built, however, did not retire. Law codes, survey lines, registers, soft power, and hard graphite remained and continued to carry the colonial day forward with the stubborn perseverance of forms. Ports learned to be imperial without feeling extravagant. Roads were the same shape under new instructions. The company's archives, a great library of decisions about pepper, salt, soap, opium, tin, tea, and postage, became the government's memory. Dividends ended, files endured. It is a kind of afterlife, not particularly poetic, but durable. Long after, you can still infer the company from the shape of a harbor or the punctuation of a boundary, as if a ghost had taken up cartography. Yet the afterlife is longer than the life. Cotton mills in Lancashire depended on yarn that once depended on monsoon patience. Shipyards that built East Indiamen taught the world how to stretch oak into distance. Insurance companies inherited the anxiety of cargo lists. And everywhere that the company wrote a line, somebody later read it as authority. You can walk into a bazaar today and watch weights descend on a balance that is technically older than empire and practically younger than last week's shipment. Then you can trace the road where those weights traveled and find that it curves because a factory wall from 1750 insisted upon it. The little hooks of continuity are as sleepy and as surprising as the flavor notes in an old blend of tea. Children climb on cannons turned into ornaments in parks. A museum guide explains that the ship's bell rang at 8 for a watch change and rings now at noon for school groups. A courthouse still stores the original company seal in a drawer that sticks. And in the quiet of a record room, A clerk fills in a conservation slip for a volume labeled Invoices, Salt, Sundries, Sundown, which is not what it says, but might as well be. The company that built Britain's empire dissolved into the empire it helped build. Then that empire dissolved as empires do, leaving infrastructure that performs a different loyalty. Roads lead to markets that sell phones. Ports host containers the size of rooms. A satellite maps the path an East Indiaman once attempted with sextant and guesswork. The arithmetic continues with new nouns. If you need a last soft irony before sleep, a corporation that began by renting a royal signature became a series of footnotes in national constitutions, and its most lasting invention may be the bureaucratic calm with which a customs officer stamps a form and waves someone through. On a warm afternoon, the stamp thuds, the ink dries, and somewhere a kettle moves toward a gentle boil, which is as close to an ending as this kind of history allows. You might not expect a tax to sprout leaves and thorns, but for much of the 19th century, the British built a hedge across India and asked it to collect revenue. Not a garden border, not a polite topiary shaped like a lion, but a living barrier intended to slow the passage of salt and, by extension, people who preferred not to pay for it. The idea is so gentle in phrasing, just a hedge, that it almost passes without friction, like a small note on a very long bill. Yet the hedge, when grown, stretched farther than some mountain ranges, a green line crawling through heat and dust with all the patience of a customs officer who eats on the job. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about the proper spacing of thorny species in alkaline soils, feel free to subscribe or simply let this drift. Sleep respects hedges. They stop your thoughts and encourage them to turn back the way they came to understand why a hedge was summoned to duty. You need to know that salt was money with a culinary accent. The East India Company, and later the Crown, taxed it because everyone needed it, and very few people are willing to argue at length with a condiment. The government set up a customs line to slow the flow of cheap salt from coast to interior. The line moved, elongated, took shortcuts like an ambitious pencil mark on a map. At first the barrier was conventional: patrols, checkpoints, piles of thorn branches. But thorn piles tire easily. They sag into honesty. Someone proposed planting a living wall instead, a hedge that could not be stolen overnight for firewood because it was rooted in the problem. The plan had the quiet logic of bureaucracy. Put shrubs on the budget, put gardeners in uniform, put a botany section into the annual report. The earliest stretches used anything with a prickly disposition: Indian plum, babool, Indian coral tree names that sound like the characters in a children's book who would absolutely keep you from your salt. Planting a customs policy is high maintenance. The soil along the line varied from sand that behaved like a rumor to black earth that remembered every monsoon. Officers wrote letters about pH levels without ever once using that term. They spoke instead of loam that welcomes roots, clay that confines them, and sands that do not care to be employed. They learned quickly that a hedge grows like gossip, faster where you don't need it, reluctant where it matters. So they developed a recipe of distance and depth, trenches spaded with a devotion usually reserved for parade grounds. The standard advised 2 trenches side by side with a central mound, each trench 3 feet deep and 4 feet across, the kind of dimensions that put you to sleep by their perfect ability to be memorized and then forgotten. Saplings went in at a measured pace, 6 to 9 inches apart in the hopeful sections, closer where goats looked enterprising. When the sun stood directly above and pretended to be permanent, men brought water by a bullock cart, 1 clay pot at a time, and poured it into the earth as if voting for a future in which shrubs outlasted smuggling. Some sections delighted the inspectors with a kind of leafy ambition. The babool thickened into a spiny arithmetic. When the monsoon remembered to arrive, the hedge exploded into a rigorously thorny green. audible with insects like the ticking of many small clocks. Birds nested. Lizards achieved tenure. Meanwhile, the bureaucracy developed a seasonal rhythm the hedge could understand. There were instructions for pruning and for the times when pruning should be avoided because it encouraged the plants to behave like teenagers. Gardeners rose before the sun to examine the line for gaps, those tempting absences that turned commerce into acrobatics. Where brackish water sneaked up from below, salt burned the roots. In those places, inspectors recommended mud walls or palisades, or, failing those, a pious hope recorded on a form in triplicate. A customs hedge is a conversation with soil in which soil has more jokes, along. This line the government built famous little stations with tiled roofs and a shade tree where guards kept the sort of ledger that records patience. They weighed baskets, nodded at permits, and frowned in the universal bureaucratic dialect. This was a landscape in which a goat could become a legal issue if it wore a suspicious expression. The guards learned the difference between salt crystals and sugar grains by the sound they made when rubbed between finger and thumb, which is a test you cannot learn quickly. Somewhere a sergeant wrote a memorandum stating that crystals the size of mustard seeds did not necessarily imply deceit. Somewhere else, a sub-collector suggested that mustard seed metaphors be retired due to confusion in the field. At night, the hedge did its quiet duty while the men brewed tea so strong that it threatened to enforce its own tariff. Mild ironies stacked up like tokens. An empire so proud of railways that it taught a shrub to govern. A policy enforced in blossoms. Smugglers, as they always do, read the rulebook carefully and then demonstrated creativity. Some cut the hedge and tried to make it look like weaned. Others bribed dissection with goats, which can be persuasive. A few attempted disassembly by night and were surprised to find plants resiliently attached to the concept of Earth. There were tunnels for a while, some so tiny that only ambition could fit through them. The reports describe these with a tone one can safely call exhaustive. Guards developed a fondness for trench repair. An inspector, praising a particularly thorny stretch, wrote that it discourages man and beast alike, which was meant as high compliment. Microhooks of fact appear here, like snagging thorns on your sleeve. A recommended tool called a hedge billhook with a handle the length of your forearm. The specification that gates should be at least 12 feet wide to admit camel trains in a manner both dignified and taxable. The instruction that hedges be kept trim, though not inviting, which reads like etiquette for unpopular ants. The line wandered over rivers and asserted itself across plains, grew shy in rocky districts, and became inventive where politics turned inconvenient. In some provinces, local rulers negotiated gaps, the classified variety of hole through which salt moved with principles attached. Elsewhere, the hedge met a roadside banyan, considered the matter, and threaded around it as if acknowledging religion. Villagers learned to live with it. Kids slipped through to visit cousins. Women leaned bundles of firewood against it while catching up on news far older than the tax. In summer, when the ground turned to the color of biscuits, dust coated everything, and a hedge seemed like a note written by the landscape reminding itself to breathe. The gardeners, who reported to the salt department with a steadiness that puts to shame most New Year's resolutions, saved cuttings in wet baskets to patch weak stretches. A single year's work might require 1 million saplings. Numbers get tall so quietly in bureaucratic prose. By the 1860s, the hedge, in its more coherent period, stretched roughly from the Indus districts toward Bengal, swerving with regional manners into a length measured in thousands of miles. Estimates vary because the line moved in the way a river moves, not by leaps but by negotiation with neighbors. But even the modest figures are drowsily immense. Competent officers took pride in their horticulture. They wrote about how a well-tended hedge could stop a man with a sack of salt as effectively as a fort. if the man had the social grace to avoid machetes. They compared sap flow rates. They held up a branch in the manner of a club and then wrote, in a paragraph below, about blossom timing. It reads like a diary kept by someone in love with a plant and a regulation simultaneously. When the hedge failed, they resigned themselves to wooden fences and earthworks, and the ancient method known as standing there and asking questions. The hedge had moods. In monsoon it fattened, sulking in excess. In winter it grew brittle and threw small tantrums of splinter. In spring it wore dust like a shawl. Every season had a smuggling-style monsoon by boat through marshy breaks. Winter by bullock cart under bundled chaff. Summer by arguing that thirst is a human right and therefore the ice in this lump is medicinal. Guards learned to look for wheel tracks that avoided gates by a suspicious degree of cleverness. They examined footprints with a seriousness that would later migrate to crime fiction. They measured the absence of dew on certain leaves and considered that evidence. A bureaucracy improves its eyesight the longer it looks at the same shrub. A few of the reports notice, almost accidentally, that people on both sides of the hedge were very good at being alive. They worked fields from dawn, bought and sold in weekly markets, married, argued, and carried salt because food without it tastes like somebody forgot the point. One clerk observed that the poorest families spent a measurable percentage of their income on the tax. He suggested mercy in a tone so careful it could be mistaken for arithmetic. Another proposed scaling the duty to seasons, then crossed out his own thought as impractical because compassion is notoriously difficult to audit. Meanwhile, policy shifted in London with the weather of Parliament. Deficits encouraged enthusiasm. Protests encouraged committees. The hedge was alternately praised as an economical triumph of rural engineering and condemned as a thorny embarrassment, which are not incompatible opinions if you write them far enough apart, and then, as policies do, the salt duty began to loosen. It did not vanish in a dramatic unbuttoning. It relaxed in stages like a bureaucrat at lunch. Some provinces reduced the rate. Others negotiated. The hedge, confronted with irrelevance, did what all living things do when the point changes. It kept growing and then, neglected, went to seed. Fences fell into the particular disgrace of wood that used to matter. Thanas closed or found new purposes. Gardeners moved to other departments where plants were less argumentative. A few sections were uprooted to make room for roads that would carry commodities more complicated than salt. On the margins of old maps, the line lingered as a dotted memory. Birds retained an opinion on the subject far longer than ministers. After independence, India kept the memory of the salt tax mostly for the chapter about Gandhi, who walked to the sea to pick up a crystal and turn it into a sentence. The hedge rarely makes the parade, which is understandable. It is not heroic. It is not tragic. It is an oddly specific solution to a simple problem, carried out with a commitment to measurement that would impress a metronome. And yet, if you drive certain back roads at a low, respectful speed, and if you watch how fields are parceled and how village paths seek shade, you can still sketch the ghost of a line that once asked people and goats to reconsider their route. You might even find, along a ditch that looks too straight to be casual, a stubborn bebold tree throwing out thorns as if bureaucracy were a seasonal wind. What remains, more than shrubs, is a tone of mind. The hedge taught a generation of officials to believe that a policy could be planted, watered, and inspected into existence. It suggested that the distance between garden and government is 3 feet deep and 4 feet across. It reminded smugglers that ingenuity is as perennial as a weed, and reminded accountants that every measure invites a workaround with a charming nickname. It looked from above like a line invented by a tidy god, and from the side it looked like patience with spikes, a less small absurdity. Manuals explained how to cut openings so that camel caravans could pass with minimal indignity. provided the appropriate receipts were presented. You picture a camel with the faintest look of bureaucracy in its eyes, stepping carefully between thorned branches while a guard blows dust from a ledger. The guard stamps the paper. The camel proceeds. Somewhere a sparrow argues with a thorn and loses. Sunlight leans against the top leaves. And the hedge, which was once an instrument of fiscal policy, makes a modest, rustling sound like someone turning a page in a long, slow book. If your eyelids lower at that, the hedge understands. Its talent was always for quiet obstruction, and sleep is a kind of smuggling the state never learned to mind. You might not think a tax could change the way a city blinks, but Britain once charged houses for the act of looking outside. Not curtains, not glassware, just the simple geometry of openings where light dared to enter. The window tax began shyly in 1696, as if it were an afterthought on a financial menu. A few shillings per house, more if the house had many eyes, with exemptions politely stapled to the edges. It was a substitute for an income tax that no one wished to count honestly, so people were invited to declare their architecture instead. A government clerk, somewhere in a chilly room, wrote that the levy was fairly assessed by the visible condition of the dwelling, which is one of those phrases that stands straighter than it should. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you're welcome to subscribe, or simply let your eyelids do what many windows did close for economy. The path from idea to street is paved with arithmetic. The original schedule set a flat charge for houses under 10 windows, and stepped it up as the wall perforations multiplied. The theory made a kind of midnight sense. Wealth favors light, and light leaves a countable trail. There were debates about whether a skylight counted as a sky argument, and whether shop displays with glass should pay twice, once for commerce, once for sunshine. Parliament, which had more time than glass, decided details with a pudding spoon. An official noted that casements of less than a certain breadth could count as half a window, a clause that encouraged carpenters to flirt with fractions. In market towns, you can still find 18th century cottages where someone installed two narrow slits a handspan apart, the architectural equivalent of paying for one sandwich and rearranging it into two. Gentlemen objected that their servants need not see the horizon, which was both a policy position and an interior design tip. Collectors went door to door, counting with the even patience of a metronome. They carried notebooks tied with string, and sometimes a small folding ladder for ambiguity. Where a window was bricked up, they asked whether it had ever been otherwise. Where a frame had been painted onto blank stone to preserve a facade's symmetry, a delicate joke that facades tell at government's expense, they recorded the illusion solemnly and moved on. One pamphleteer suggested that, to avoid arguments, the law should count apertures that admit a hat, which is unforgettable if not enforceable. Another wrote anxiously about bay windows, which he feared would be taxed by volume like a naval cask. An inspector in Bath reported that householders had developed a talent for removable panes, so that during his visit the hole would politely cease to be a hole until he left. He recommended, in prose as calm as a teacup, that future legislation define window as any opening made or maintained for the purposes of air or light, a sentence that sounds like a tiny constitution, but taxes are like water. They find seams and make unanticipated gardens. Builders adapted. New houses sprouted fewer, larger windows to minimize the count while maximizing lumens, the architectural equivalent of buying in bulk. In some places, the fashionable Georgian facade learned to wink. 3 windows on the top floor, 2 on the second, 1 on the ground, a rhythm that matched the wallet more than the soul. Doctors warned about the health of rooms that had learned to squint. A pamphlet from 1766 attempted a medical argument, claiming that imprisoned air encouraged fevers and very low spirits, a conclusion that carried the whiff of experience. Families developed a choreography of daylight. The good room opened its shutters only for guests or laundry. The staircase wore a glass lantern in the roof, like a modest crown. A nursery rotated its desk to catch the narrow band of morning that snuck between the neighboring chimneys. If you have ever shifted your chair in a cafe to borrow sun from a stranger's window, you have reenacted a minor detail of fiscal history in London, where buildings lined up like soldiers who ate too well, the tax-bent streets toward dusk. You can still trace the habit in brickwork. Look up, and you find the ghost rectangles where mortar and matching brick now live. Often the bricked-up window keeps a faint stone sill and the vestigial curve of a lintel, as if the wall remembers what it once knew and declines to talk about it. These blind windows earned a reputation: poor man's pains, king's eyes, or more simply, light stoppered. A satirical verse reported that a landlord, asked why there were so many blind windows on his terrace, replied cheerfully, "I'm not paying for someone else's daydreams." The joke is soft as bread, but it sticks. A microfact slips in here. Some parishes reduced their workhouse window counts to balance budgets. A policy decision with the moral temperature of a damp sock. The tax inspectors, like gardeners, learn the seasons of evasion. In winter, with leafless trees tattling on everything, counting ran smoothly. In summer, ivy conspired. It draped itself with such innocent enthusiasm that a diagonal stem could suggest brickwork where glass waited shyly behind it. The more pious citizens claimed the interference of nature as divine advice and paid accordingly. Others trained vine stems to act as modesty screens for surplus panes during annual inspections. A case in Yorkshire mentions a farmer who, upon hearing the approach of the officer along the lane, would slide wooden panels across 2 upstairs frames and place a large cheese on the sill of a third to produce an impression more opaque than glass. The officer noted the cheese and, lacking guidance on dairy, decided not to count it. Bureaucracy is at its most humane when confronted with lunch. As the 18th century ripened into the 19th, the scale of the thing grew comfortable. The rates went up. Deadpan reports recorded the revenue in tidy columns, the totals rising and falling with economic weather. War with France encouraged Parliament to lean harder on daylight. The tax became one of those quiet certainties like postage or lamplighters, mildly resented, widely tolerated, not quite loved. Architects developed a professional shrug. The great building manuals of the period mention the tax the way a cookbook notes oven temperatures unromantically, as a condition of success. In the countryside, grand houses could afford to ignore the rows of arithmetic and simply pay, then boast of the number of windows as if they were a herd of glass-eyed cattle. A guidebook to Derbyshire in 1822 admired a mansion with 124 lights to the garden, as though this were a form of patriotism. Meanwhile, the middle floors of towns performed a minute theater of light. Morning staff opened shutters with the authority of stage managers. Noon made brief visits to inner rooms via fanlights and borrowed corridors, those delicate glass patches above doors that carry sun like a rumor. Children learned that some rooms were for winter because the family budget could not afford constant brightness. In cheaper lodging houses, rooms were subdivided to multiply rent, and the new partitions sometimes produced chambers without any window at all, spare spaces where the air went to think about nothing. One reformer labeled these coffin rooms, and newspapers printed the phrase with the horrified satisfaction that often accompanies a useful scandal. Physicians diagrammed dwellings to prove that disease lingered in gloom, and hinted that a government which taxed sunlight would eventually have to tax funerals for balance. The humor of the period approves of the absurd. Cartoons showed a chimney sweep presenting himself as a window-bunging contractor. A mock advertisement offered imitation windows, suitable for the modest household, painted to a realistic gleam, guaranteed not to admit drafts, arguments, or tax obligations. Someone asked in print whether mirrors should be charged double because they persuade a room it has more windows than it does. A society lady claimed with playful solemnity that the greatest danger of the tax was squinting. She reported that at afternoon tea, one could tell the frugal households by the wrinkles at the corners of the eye. None of this alters a ledger, but it adds a soft cushion to a hard policy. You can mark the beginning of the end with the slow advance of moral algebra. After 1830, reformers acquired committees, and committees acquired reports, and reports acquired a tone that could stand furniture, calm, thorough, and sure of being archived. They collected evidence from doctors, architects, clergymen, and tailors, because a tailor knows how much daylight you need to thread a needle, and thus contributes a data point no philosopher can supply. Town surveys showed districts where only the front rooms saw the sun, while back rooms complied with policy by growing dim. A parliamentary hearing took testimony from a woman who had kept her aged mother in a windowless cubby for warmth, which was a strategic word to use when talking to men in waistcoats. When statistics arrived infant mortality, Kohler maps the correlation. Between darkness and damp, the tax began to look expensive in currency not measured by the treasury dot. By the 1840s, the window tax had acquired that political condition familiar to items in an old pantry, too useful to throw away, too embarrassing to show guests. France had abandoned its own version, which irritated the patriotic nerve. A few municipalities experimented with replacing the tax with an equivalent on inhabited houses, a pivot from counting panes to counting habitants, which sounds dull until you try to define inhabited. Proposals skittered through the press like late afternoon sun through leaves. Was a house occupied if the family spent the season in Brighton, leaving a footman and a bored canary? Were empty rooms merely waiting rooms with better acoustics? The debates entertained themselves while gaslighting improved and made the policy feel even older. It is difficult to tax daylight when people begin to make their own. Repeal, when it came in 1851, was not a thunderclap. It was the quiet undoing of a habit. The Chancellor of the Exchequer explained it as part of a general rebalancing of revenue, which is the kind of sentence accountants frame and sheep ignore. The law replaced the window duty with a house tax of simpler arithmetic. Newspapers celebrated with cartoons of London suddenly blinking in surprise, and with editorials that claimed the nation had thrown open its eyes to health. Families wrote to relatives that they would soon reopen their bricked-up panes, as if asking permission to breathe. Builders got busy. Within a year, masons chipped back the plaster around hundreds of pale scars and restored glass that had been paper all along. Some houses delighted, overcorrected, and developed entire walls of sash windows like a smile with too many teeth. And yet many blind windows remained. The brick had settled. The plaster had made friends. The upstairs cupboard had crawled into the space where a light used to be and refused to relocate. Architects, who have their own loyalty to symmetry, sometimes preferred the pattern of voids to the unpredictable resumption of light. A house designed to wear two eyes and a scar can look oddly surprised if the scar turns into an eye again. A few streets kept their bricked ovals as a kind of historical punctuation, an archaic comma reminding the sentence it might have been different. When industrial smoke later streaked the air and a thick coal dusk hung over cities, some owners even argued that sealed windows were prudent against soot, a phrase that suggests history sometimes learns to laugh without needing anyone else taught today. If you walk through older districts and look up with unhurried attention, you can play a private game called Count the Saved Pennies. Each blind window is a story no one finished telling. Here, a tidy rectangle across which a mason laid bricks with a level, then scratched his initials into the fresh mortar like a tiny signature on darkness. There, a pair of ghost frames flanking a central window, as if a house once practiced to smile and kept it. In the countryside, farmhouses with deep walls keep their bricked spaces like spare pockets. In certain cities, Edinburgh, York, parts of London, an entire terrace will display the pattern, as though the street has decided to perform a faintly comic act. The synchronized wink of thrift dot if the tax appears again in speech. It is usually to make a point about unintended consequences. Urban historians use it to explain why some courtyards feel like wells. Economists cite it as an old friend in the club of perverse incentives. Doctors mention it when discussing 19th century ventilation, which is a topic as exciting as a folded pillowcase and just as necessary. Most of us stand under a row of bricked blanks and think, for a moment, about the price of looking out. And then we go on, because the present asks different questions. How many charging points on a street? How many bins for a block? How many minutes until the bus emits its tender sigh? The small details linger. An 1803 form, printed with elegant confidence, left space for number of lights exceeding 6 in front or rear. A builder's ledger from 1821 recorded a day's work. To brick up 3 windows, 2 men, 8 hours each, mortar, 4 South 6D. A recipe book written by a country mother advised hanging jam jars on the inner side of a windowless pantry door, because sugar and the dark are friends. A child's letter from 1849 to her aunt in Leeds reads, "We have opened the little one above the stair. Mother says it is like letting the morning in by the hand." These are not statistics. They are the soft feet of policy walking across a wooden floor dot. It is tempting to moralize and say that a nation that taxes windows loses sight of itself, but the truth is simpler and cozier. Governments count what they can see. People adapt in ways that preserve tea times. Carpentry learns new tricks when the treasury coughs. Sunlight negotiates terms with brick and almost always wins eventually. The lost windows, those neat rectangles of memory, become part of a town's face. The little freckles you notice only after a long friendship. They anchor the eye the way an old bookmark marks not only a page, but also a mood dot if you find yourself in a room where the light seems to come from the side, and the wall opposite is surprisingly plain. You might be standing with your back to a space that once watched the street. Press your palm against it. The plaster keeps a faint coolness. On the outside, rain will write its quick handwriting over a rectangle that has forgotten how to be wet. Above, a pigeon will practice the art of declaring sovereignty from a sill that used to be a stage. Someone indoors will pour tea in a place where a tax once argued with morning. And somewhere, in an archive draw linen tape, binding the files so gently it is almost a lullaby a clerk's neat hand will list. For a house long modified, 10 lights to the front, 4 to the back, 1 disposed of. It is a sleepy phrase, disposed of, like the final sigh of a day. The country blinked differently for a while, and then it blinked again. If your eyes are closing now, that's all right. The windows can keep watch. They have training. You might not expect a train schedule to change the way people boiled eggs, but clocks took instructions from rails long before phones told them what to do. For most of human timekeeping, noon lived where the sun stood still over your own street. The baker's noon was not the cooper's noon. In a nearby village, noon arrived a few minutes later, as if the day had a lazy gait and liked to linger. Sundials agreed with nothing but sunlight. Church keepers wound tower clocks when it felt appropriate, and occasionally when they remembered. A visitor traveling 15 miles west could return home with the cheerful conviction that the afternoon had repeated itself. This was not a problem until iron tracks drew straight lines through fields that preferred curves. Trains dislike variety in any form. They prefer one noon to 100 local versions. The timetables that poured from printers in the 1840s looked tidy, but behind their columns lay a forest of little different noons. If you're still awake by the time we get to the international conference about meridians, feel free to subscribe, or simply let your eyelids adopt the same policy as Liverpool in 1847 and quietly close 5 minutes behind London, Railway clerks took out pencils and made compromises that sounded like lullabies. London time, which kept company with the instrument makers at Greenwich, began to spread along the lines like tea creeping across a blotter. Station masters set their clocks by a master chronometer in the capital, then promised to explain to local citizens why their sun had developed a small delay. At first they did it with the steady authority of a person who sells tickets and therefore understands destiny. Later they did it with telegraph signals, a wire-bound whisper that carried the beat of a standard second outwards. There is something gentle about the idea of time traveling down copper like warm milk in a pipe. Not everyone enjoyed the change. A Devon newspaper protested that God's time was being replaced by railway time, which sounds like an accusation, but also like a timetable printed by angels. In practice, people simply added or subtracted a few minutes out loud in casual conversation. "Meet me at 1 by your time," a letter might say, which is perhaps the most polite way to disagree with the sun. Greenwich itself kept time with a stately playfulness. Each day at exactly 1 o'clock, a red ball descended a mast on the hill above the Thames. Ships in the river lifted their eyes, then their logbooks, and set their chronometers to this falling berry of certainty. The signal required no speech, only attention. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, the town fired a noon gun so loudly that dogs added their own comments. In Edinburgh, a gun atop the castle spoke on behalf of the observatory. The history of standard time is full of these quiet pageants. A shop window in Manchester displayed a pendulum clock wired to the telegraph line that pulsed from Greenwich. Citizens watched its second-hand jump, as if the city's heart were briefly startled and then reassured. The instrument makers sold regulators, clocks that pretended to discipline every other clock in the room. Meanwhile, 1,000 household timepieces carried on being themselves, slow by habit, fast by enthusiasm, and kept honest by the ritual of occasional comparison. Letters to newspaper editors developed a tone of gentle arithmetic. A correspondent from Oxford asked whether town hall and railroad should both adjust when the equation of time and astronomical quirk made the sun itself drift from mean noon by a few minutes. The editor replied with sympathy and no change of policy. An inn advertised that its dining room observed local solar time while its billiard room favored Greenwich, inadvertently encouraging patrons to eat early and play late. A meticulous gentleman noted in his diary that he lost 3 minutes walking from his study, which kept local time, to the reading room of the Philosophical Society, which did not. He resolved to walk more quickly and never did. If you have ever set your kitchen clock 5 minutes fast so your future self will hurry and then calmly ignored it, you have joined the society in spirit. Some towns tried compromise clocks with 2-minute hands. One hand saluted the sun, the other respected the railway. It was like reading a book with 2 bookmarks and insisting that both were correct. People learned to whisper twice when arranging a meeting. Watchmakers developed dial faces with tiny auxiliary scales and sold them without irony. Soon, however, habit hardened into economy. Shops opened by railway time because trains delivered customers who own railway watches. Letters posted in time to meet the afternoon mail were timed by the afternoon mail. The old local moons lingered as personality lovely but unprofitable. You can feel the transition in municipal records, where clerks switch from describing minutes past 12 by the town clock to the clipped certainty of 12:07 p.m. A sentence that used to look through a window begins to consult a ledger dot by the 1880s. The wires and rails together had created an invisible map with neat squares of agreement. North America, which has always enjoyed solutions that come in fours, divided itself into broad zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. On a particular Saturday in 1883, railroads executed what they called the Day of Two Noons. setting their clocks to the zones at exactly noon by a timetable that itself needed a timetable. A few local dignitaries made speeches, but the earth did not wobble, and the cows continued their private negotiations with milking time. The next morning, churches rang bells as usual, and parishioners appeared a few minutes earlier or later in a spirit of experimental piety. A minister in rural Ohio wrote that he intended to preach in Eastern Standard Time, but accept confessions in local time out of charity. The congregation did not notice the difference. Europe preferred to argue elegantly. France, where the Paris Observatory had its own excellent meridian, regarded Greenwich with the courtesy one reserves for a neighbor's unusually tidy garden, admirable, not necessarily adoptable. Spain and Italy watched their railways lean northward or westward toward whichever standard, made schedules look less like embroidery. Austria-Hungary admired Central European time because it felt symphonic. Switzerland, which knows something about watches, considered everything and then chose a solution so rational that it looked like modesty. Russia stretched so far that it adopted 11 time zones, then later decided that this was both correct and exhausting. Yet even the exceptions conspired to demonstrate the rule. One Earth, many slices. Each slice a promise that noon will visit when it is supposed to and leave without offense. In 1884, the International Meridian Conference met in Washington, D.C. to formalize what practice had already composed. The delegates were polite men with measured smiles and the air of people who had agreed in principle before they arrived. They elected Greenwich as the prime meridian because, as one historian observes in a sentence as gentle as a shrug, most of the world's ships already used it. The French abstained with dignity and continued to print maps centered on Paris for several more decades, a cartographic way of finishing one's tea after the party has moved to the next room. The conference decisions read like bedtime rules, nothing frightening, everything tidy. The world would count longitude east and west of Greenwich. The day would start at midnight, and everyone would use the same second, as if seconds were coins minted with no national crest. When the conference ended, nothing immediate happened in most kitchens, which is the correct pace for a global decision. Telegraph offices continued to send their ticks. The time balls continued their daily shyness. The standard sea chronometers aboard ships continued to cradle their balance wheels against the pitch of waves. What did change, quietly, was the temperature of conversation. The phrase "by Greenwich time" or "by Berlin time" melted into "by the clock," a tiny linguistic merger that left the sun free to mind the weather. People who had set watches by asking a neighbor to hold a pocket watch next to a tower clock now listened for a signal sent from a city far away, or read the time printed in a newspaper's weather column. Time became a public utility, like water, delivered through pipes of brass and metaphor dot. The domestic consequences were charmingly fussy. Recipe books began specifying minutes instead of until done, a victory for clocks and a small defeat for instinct. Factory whistles announced shifts according to schedules calibrated with signals from observatories. Workers learned the exact location of 5 minutes late on their foreheads. Post office directories published opening hours with a precision that made punctuation shiver. 9 o'clock, 1:30, 4:45. Households placed their loan case, clocks against walls where the floorboards were least inclined to sulk, then wound them each Sunday with a loyalty that practically counted as worship. A few eccentrics resisted. An elderly gentleman in Dorset kept his pocket watch in what he called parish time until the end of his life, which occurred approximately at 3:07 p.m. Standard Time on a February afternoon, though his diary politely recorded it as 8 minutes earlier, because human beings enjoy seasonal drama. Daylight saving time arrived as a theatrical intermission, proposed in odd tones, part military efficiency, part gardening enthusiasm, It asked whole nations to move their clocks forward in spring and back again in autumn. Many citizens complied with the considerate resignation they usually reserve for dental appointments. Others refused cheerfully and missed trains with artistic regularity. Printers enjoyed the boom in explanatory posters. In some towns, the church bell rang twice on the appointed night, once for the old hour and again for the new, as if the belfry itself were performing a duet. Farmers, who had always organized their labor around light rather than numerals, watched the experiment with the philosophical calm of people who already know. How many hours are in a day? The technology of telling everyone the same thing at once continued its discrete progress. Radio stations learned to preface the evening news with a series of beeps that represented 1 exact second each. Families gathered around the wireless to learn not only what Parliament had said, but exactly when it was, to within a tenth of a heartbeat. The pips, as the British beeps are called, became a national background sound, like kettles or evening footsteps in semi-detached streets. In America, WV sent out tones from Colorado. In France, the observatory in Paris slid time into the air the way a bakery slips fragrance into morning. Later, when television joined the chorus, a small graphic in the corner of the screen occasionally advertised correct time by teletext, as if truth could be downloaded as easily as subtitles. Asterisk. Wristwatches learned new tricks as they marched through the 20th century. Some synchronized themselves at night by listening to low-frequency radio signals that hummed through the walls, like invisible bees. In the late century, satellites began to transmit time so precise that engineers had to consider relativistic. Corrections, the tiny fact that clocks on fast-moving or high-flying machines experienced the day at a slightly different rate from clocks sitting quietly on a desk next to a mug of tea. It is a complicated way of admitting that a second spent in an airplane is not quite the same as a second spent choosing a biscuit. Most of us mercifully ignore the mathematics and accept that our phone knows better than we do. We glance at it as if consulting a pocket-sized astronomer who never blinks. There is a comic tenderness in the things that refuse to keep up. Some town hall dials still drift a minute or two because pigeons enjoy the warmth of the clock hands and the mechanism politely accommodates them. A village shop writes back at 2 on a card and returns at 2:17 because conversation has a different zone of its own. In Venice, where water negotiates every appointment, a baker sets his oven by the humidity in the air and the sound his dough makes when it sighs. Even the most standardized systems allow local exceptions in practice. Trains occasionally wait for a late connection from a neighboring line. Ships delay departure until the tide remembers itself. Time may be standardized, but patience remains gloriously artisanal. International cooperation produced small curiosities. There's a place in Spain that keeps the same clock as Germany, which is suitable for a nation that eats dinner at what appears to be tomorrow. China decided to have a single time zone despite its width. In the far west, the sun performs its duties as if it had missed a memo, and people quietly develop household schedules that honor both the official hour and the local sky. In Nepal, the clocks run 5 hours and 45 minutes ahead of Greenwich because a round number did not feel specific enough. Australia's middle divides itself into halves and quarters as if practicing fractions. The map of time zones looks like a patchwork quilt sewn by a family that enjoyed conversation more than symmetry. Underneath the system, a very old problem continues. The Earth refuses to spin at a perfectly constant speed. It slows and quickens by small amounts that make astronomers breathe gently and accountants look brave. To keep atomic time, the rhythm set by cesium atoms in laboratories, close to the turning of the world. International timekeepers occasionally add a leap second. On those rare nights, a clock that has just displayed DY shows DY before moving on, as if the day were taking a cautious extra step onto a bus. Most people do not notice. A few computer servers panic like cats surprised by their own reflection. Someone somewhere is tasked with staying up to shepherd databases through the moment. The universe clears its throat and continues. The museums of time are quieter than they deserve to be. At Greenwich, the great chronometers sit behind glass with the serene intelligence of fish in a very precise aquarium. Their brass gleams with the polish of generations of caretakers, each of whom learned to wind with two hands at once and to carry a machine as if it were a sleeping child. On a shelf nearby rests a time ball that once told ships when to correct their clocks. A sign explains, without dramatics, that it still drops each day. If you stand on the terrace at 1 o'clock, you can watch it descend. And if you listen carefully, you can hear the city noticing. In Boston, a bell once connected to a telegraph line from Harvard Observatory hangs like a memory. At noon, it rang without fail, and the city set itself to it as calmly as a reader aligns a bookmark with a margin. Modern life is an unembarrassed choreography of minutes. Buses report their exact approach with little digital sighs. Offices schedule meetings that begin at 9:07 because algorithms say that is when people are most likely to attend. Fitness watches encourage standing at 10 minutes to the hour with a gentle nudge, which is tyrannical only if you dislike your own spine. Airports live by time with a discipline that, if given to philosophy, would have solved everything. Yet under the numerical order, there remains a human softness. Friends text, here in 5, which has never once been true. A parent reads one more page to a child at bedtime and lets the standardized minute become elastic for the sake of a dream. If you would like a touching example of standard time meeting small life, think of the shopkeepers who used to set pocket watches each morning by the clock in the jeweler's window and then went back to work content. They did not need the International Meridian Conference so much as they needed a neighbor who wound a clock carefully. Or consider the telegraph boys in the 1890s who, during an electrical storm, would run to the next office carrying written signals because the wires had decided to hum to themselves. Human beings are the adapters in this story, the little springs that make the big pendulum feel welcome. Wherever you are, your local noon probably happens at some tidy number agreed upon by people you will never meet. The sun cooperates without signing anything. On certain days, the light slants into your room exactly when the clock says it should, and you feel the pleasure of a world briefly aligned with both mathematics and the cup of tea in your hand. On other days, clouds interrupt the performance, and you drink the tea anyway. You can, if you like, visit a bricked-up observatory in some provincial town and stand quietly in a room where, a century and a half ago, a clerk waited for a telegraph click that would tell him to pull a lever and drop a ball. He would do so at exactly the agreed second, and down on the street, 2 boys would look up and agree that time had just happened. Tomorrow they would do it again. We live inside that agreement now, so comfortably that we hardly feel it. Trains thread their way through cities that used to quarrel with noon. Ovens hum at 180 degrees for precisely timed cakes, and people politely move meetings by 15 minutes as if they were rearranging chairs. Somewhere, a laboratory counts 9 billion something oscillations to define a second, while a grandmother decides that the soup is done when it smells done. Both methods work. If your eyes are heavy, you may let them close. The minutes will proceed unsupervised. A standard second is a tidy thing, but sleep honors a different zone entirely. The clock on your nightstand will hold the place for you. It has been practicing for more than 100 years. You might not expect the shape of a sheet of paper to win a quiet global contest, but rectangles have ambitions, and they carry them very neatly. The next time you fold in a 4-sheet in half and it becomes a 5 year participating in a small piece of geometry that once convinced ministry's printers, envelope makers, and eventually school children that life runs better when the halves look like their parent. In earlier centuries, paper did not inherit proportions, it inherited personalities. Venetian bookmen bought median, chancery, and imperial sheets as if selecting cheeses. French paper mills offered pot, which bore a watermark shaped like a cooking pot, to remind you that the naming committee went to lunch before finishing. In England, foolscap carried the jaunty profile of a jester's cap, while demi sounded serious without explaining itself. Each size had a story, and the stories did not line up in a drawer. Print shops kept racks like wardrobes for a polite family of rectangles that refused to share shirts. The modern eye sees romance in this clutter. The modern office manager sees invoices. If you remain awake when we reach the envelope committee in 1925, feel free to subscribe or simply fold the thought in half and place it with the others. The idea of one shape to rule them all arrived slowly, and with the mathematical shyness of people who bring rulers to a picnic. 18th century natural philosophers observed that if you take a rectangle whose sides are in the ratio of 1 to the square root of 2 and you cut it across its middle, you get two smaller rectangles of exactly the same shape. The family resemblance is perfect. There's no awkward cousin. The German polymath Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, who enjoyed electrical experiments and tidy logic, pointed this out in 1786, then returned to the lightning. Paper makers at the time were busy with vats and decals, and the idea waited in a drawer of the mind, while Europe struggled with revolutions and with the pleasant difficulty of remembering which sheet matched which press. In the 19th century, industrial papermaking turned rag into roll and roll into endless possibilities. Endless possibility fills warehouses with boxes labeled approx. The problem looked more administrative than romantic, and that is the sort of problem that wakes a certain kind of engineer happily in the night. By 1922, the German Standards Institute, which answers to the calming name of DIN, published a neat table called DIN 476. It began with a sheet whose area was 1 square meter and whose sides shared that special ratio. Cut it in half and you had a 1, cut again a 2. Continue until you arrive at a 10, a size that can be mistaken for a crumb. The scheme felt like a well-swept floor. Printers discovered that layout became a friendly arithmetic. Envelopes nested like birds. Filing cabinets swallowed their contents without indigestion. A0 was the idea. A1 was a large plan. A 2 became an honest poster. A 3 worked for drawings. A 4 slipped into briefcases and stayed. The beauty of the set rests in that hereditary shape. Fold in a 4 and you get an A5 booklet that looks like it belongs. Expand an A5 into a 4, and the type grows without rethinking itself. The Standard did not make books more profound. It made photocopiers less dramatic. The way this Standard spread offers the sort of plot that people forget to film: calm memos, helpful diagrams, patient persuasion. Governments adopted the series because governments enjoy forms that take up predictable space. Trade associations endorsed it because envelopes prefer not to guess. Publishers liked the way lines of text multiplied cleanly when a page was reduced. The margins stayed polite, as if trained in a German kindergarten. In the 1970s, the International Organization for Standardization blessed the idea with ISO 216, and countries nodded in orderly clusters. Japan, having its own traditions of elegant paper, adopted the system with characteristic precision while keeping the trim poetry of B-series sizes for books. France allowed the metric rectangles to join the family without evicting old cousins from historic archives. The world did not agree all at once, but it agreed in large, quiet regions, like a map coloring itself while someone brewed tea. And yet there are places where a 4 encountered a very polite barricade. In the United States and parts of Canada and Mexico, the everyday sheet remained stubbornly letter 8.5 by 11 inches, a figure with no mathematical myth but a deep affection for office culture. The reasons are a blend of manufacturing habit, equipment inertia, and the national pastime of being cheerfully different. Letter takes slightly less height and slightly more width than a 4, which means that when you print an A4 document on a letter machine, a line of text sometimes wanders into the bottom margin to look at the view. People became skilled at saying fit to page with the same tone used for add salt to taste. Legal professionals favored a longer cousin called legal, as if justice required room for footnotes to pace. Stationery stores learned to stock multiple envelopes that perform the same job with slightly different opinions. It is hard to be angry at any of this. Paper has manners even when it disagrees. The standard brought with it a modest revolution in folding, which is exactly the scale of revolution suited to office life. Before DIN 476, folding a letter for an envelope could resemble origami designed by a tired clerk. Afterward, the C-series envelopes arrived as a gentle conspiracy. A C4 envelope takes an A4 sheet unfolded. A C5 takes the same sheet once folded. A DL, narrow and businesslike, accommodates an F4 folded into 3 equal portions, a motion now so common that fingers remember it without eyes. An entire industry of creasing machines, trimmers, and binders began to market not the promise of innovation, but the guarantee of correctness, which is arguably more restful. You could now send an invoice to any country that accepted the scheme and be reasonably sure the recipient would not need to tilt their head. Imagine being an envelope and knowing that the letters you will meet on your route were made for you. It is practically romance. Printers, once temperamental artists, relaxed into operators of reliable rituals. Paper sizes became drop-down menus. Copiers learned to recognize each format and to complain politely when they were fed the wrong one, in the tone of a librarian who has seen worse. Office workers learn terms like duplex and collate, which make one, sound briefly mechanical in the pleasant way of pushing the button for a lift. When desktop publishing arrived, the first thing the software asked was not about beauty, but about size. A question that designers answer the way a chef answers, which pan. A 4 became the measuring stick for CVS, school handouts, and the mysterious pile near the kettle. The standard even taught printers to behave internationally. An A4 brochure could be printed in Helsinki, mailed to Lisbon, photocopied in Nairobi, and filed in Singapore, and it would be the same brochure, only more traveled. There were, of course, dissenters with charm. Artists love paper that behaves like a landscape rather than a grid. Sketch pads retain proportions that flatter drawing. Photographers conduct their own quiet rebellion. The popular 3:2 or 4:3 ratios do not marry A-series politely, so prints can sprout white borders like thoughtful eyebrows. The standard never demanded obedience from the arts. It simply offered a background texture for ordinary life, like the distance between traffic lights or the height of kitchen countertops. Even within the system, kindness persevered. The B-series, slightly larger than the A's, flourishes in publishing as a way to give a cover a little breathing room around an inner block. The Japanese yeast versions adjust a millimeter here and there to suit local machinery that is too well-mannered to object. Standards, like friendships, tolerate small preferences. If you enjoy the archaeology of offices, look into the history of margins. Before standardization, printers kept generous margins to accommodate trimming and the way paper wandered during production. When a series sheets arrived with predictable sizes, designers reduced margins just enough to save a surprising amount of paper tiny economies multiplied by government print runs, create forests that never leave. The famous print preview feature on computers owes a quiet debt to the certainty that a page will resemble its on-screen cousin. Even the little word portrait to mean tall pages and landscape to mean wide ones settled into vocabulary because the pages themselves stopped having individual names as if the personalities had been absorbed into 2 temperaments. The standard reached schools with a thump. Exercise books harmonized. Teachers developed the reflex of asking for 2 sides of a 4 with the ceremonial rhythm of a spell. Children learned to fold covers into briefcases that would someday hold a 4 resumes and a 4 apartment contracts with a 4 clauses. A sheet became a unit of homework, a negotiable currency measurable in size. In exam halls, the invigilator handed out bundles that rustled like synchronized leaves. In the margins of those sheets, millions of thoughts have learned to pace. A 4 is a quiet teacher. It says, take up this much space, it is enough. If you need more, fold. If you need less, cut. Somewhere a child learns that having the long side gives the short side, and that this is not a trick, but a promise. The law courts adapted with a curious grace. Judges who once stacked foolscap now stack A4. The stacks look different, but the arguments audible within them remain the same length. A few professions cling by tradition to older sizes, and archivists smile, because the world would be less interesting if every shelf were predictable. Archivists, incidentally, do not admire a 4 for elegance. They admire it for making boxes fit. Libraries in countries that adopted the standard can order storage with the confidence of people who measure in whole numbers. In vaults where humidity and temperature are numbers with decimal points, the shelves hold centuries with one dimension in common. In kitchens, printers crouch next to fruit bowls, ready to exhale recipes that match the magnetic clips on refrigerators. Napkins folded under teacups have roughly the shape of a 5, though they will never join the committee. Domestic life slowly bends to the gentle magnetism of these rectangles. Moving boxes for books assume multiples of a 4. Filing sleeves embrace them with plastic affection. Ring binders judge other sizes gently but firmly. The home office, that recent invention, exists because a table can become a workplace simply by receiving a stack of sheets and a device that eats them one at a time. When paper promises to behave, the room relaxes into purpose. The most visible challenge to A-series calm comes from screens that prefer their own proportions. Phones ally themselves with video, which like 16:9, or when standing upright and hoping for attention, 9:16. Laptops settle somewhere between golden rectangles and practical kindness to keyboards. When we print from a screen, we notice the compromise. An enthusiastic image may grow polite white borders, or the printer may rotate it with good intentions. Office software therefore begins its documents with an introduction. Would you like a 4? It asks a user in Manila or Milan, already knowing the answer. In countries that remain faithful to letter, the default flips without remark, as if software were a courteous host setting the table to local custom. If you could visit a standards committee meeting, you would see the drama in miniature. Diagrams on the wall copy that takes minutes to decide between hot and tepid engineers who carry mechanical pencils and secretaries who understand the power of small words. The discussions use phrases like tolerance, which does not mean patience here, but a measurement of acceptable variation. Still, it feels appropriate. The committee's minutes read like lullabies for machines. The long side is 297 millimeters, plus or minus 2, and somewhere a guillotine nods. Occasionally, someone proposes a new series, perhaps for door signs or concert programs, and the room considers whether civilization needs an official size for reminders to wash hands. The answer is often yes. We are a species that standardizes so that our chaos can arrive politely. Strange facts accumulate like paper clips. The A.O. sheet is so large that a breeze in a print shop will fold it like an exasperated flag. A2 posters are frequently pasted on fences the very day a municipal worker leaves a sign saying posters are not to be pasted on fences. Banknote printers use their own hermetic sizes because money enjoys secrets. Ticket stubs at small ferries and grand museums rarely match A-series, not out of defiance, but because the human hand understands small rectangles that tear nicely. In certain European supermarkets, the shelf labels match A8. and a quiet clerk has a machine that cuts them by the hundred while thinking about potatoes. The world is full of these civil niceties you can only see if you know what size they are trying to be. When documents travel between A4 and letter countries, they develop a charming accent. A curriculum vitae composed in London produces a second page half empty when printed in Chicago. A Chicago contract compresses itself in Berlin and adds a new page solely to protect a widow from a clause migrating into the footer. International organizations have developed bilingual habits. They use A4 internally because their headquarters are frequently in a series cities, then export to letter by adding a margin of goodwill. If you are designing a form for the world, you choose generous white space and lines that do not sulk when pushed. You learn that global cooperation is impossible without 12-point fonts and instructions that fit within every empire of paper. Recycling plants measure time in baled seconds. A bale of A4 office paper contains thousands of conversations that agreed politely to end. The pulp returns as new as series stock, perhaps with a faint memory of Prismacolor from a meeting that invented nothing and enjoyed itself anyway. The circularity suits the geometry. A shape that reproduces itself ideally has a life that does the same. You can fold an A4 10 times in your imagination and get to a size a mouse could write upon, although the fiber will refuse you sooner than the mathematics will. In classrooms, students write on graph paper where the grid and the ratio cohabit in domestic peace. A child learns that half the long side is the short side, and that this is why their workbook fits in their folder. The knowledge is not heroic. It is adjacent to the knowledge that two socks make a pair. One could write a romance in which A4 is the sensible protagonist who keeps a household together while adventurous sheets run off to art school. But the kindly truth is that standards do not need romance to be lovable. They embody small mercies. A world where a scanner in Nairobi understands a letterhead from Oslo. A conference where speakers trade handouts without apologizing for the margins. A morning when a passport photocopy fits the immigration window without trimming. They also allow a special kind of laziness that is actually efficiency. When graver minds worry about important questions, the rest of us print, fold, and file without complaint. Civilization advances when a boring thing becomes dependable. Some evenings, you may notice that your desk has arranged itself into layers of paper with no intention of leaving. Bills, notes, recipes, a booklet from a museum exhibit during a rainy holiday, and a draft of something that might yet become something. If you measure the pile with a finger, you might guess how many sheets thick it is. If you lift the corner, you feel the flex that only a certain size provides. Somewhere in that stack is a perfect half of another page, and the two recognize each other at once. You could spend a moment admiring the quiet intelligence embedded in the fraction square root 2. Then you might think about dinner. The sheets will wait with the patience of trees that remember the wind. I like to imagine a distant morning when a crane lifts a pallet of fresh. A4 reams onto a warehouse shelf, and the forklift driver, who is older than the boxes, notes that the sound is the same as it was when he began. Forks slide, cardboard sighs, plastic wrap crackles, and the day continues. 1,000 offices open their doors, and 1,000 little red or green lights on printers declare themselves ready. Somewhere, a child folds a paper plane that happens to be aerodynamically happier when born from a 5. Somewhere, a municipal clerk picks up a stamp and presses a date into a corner with soft finality. Somewhere, a poet prints a poem that occupies only the top third of the page and leaves the rest as a generous afternoon. If you are very sleepy now, the geometry will continue without you. The drawers will keep their quiet promises. Envelopes will receive their folded guests. Scanners will wake and do one job extremely well. On your table, a single A4 sheet waits with the patience of good manners. It will accept a list, a letter, a sketch, a recipe, a poem, a plan, or simply the weight of your hand. Fold it once, and it becomes something else that is still itself, folded again and again. Whatever else the world changes, half of this rectangle will always be ready to meet the other half, edge to edge, as calmly as two friends who never raise their voices.